Welcome back to Salty Slumber Stories, a place where we drift together through the misty stories of the past and allow the measured flow of the narrative to carry us to a peaceful sleep. Today, we continue our quiet journey through the legends and wild expanses of Newfoundland, following the book Newfoundland and Its Untrodden Ways. The adventurous notes from 1907 by the British naturalist, artist, and explorer John Millet. Get comfortable as we delve into the harsh beauty of the island, onto the windswept plateaus where deer trails intertwine like threads, into forests full of shadows and moss, to quiet campsites where stories are told by the fire. In this episode, we open the second chapter, Caribou Hunting at Lake St. John, a tale of patience, search, and the long waiting that wild nature so often demands from those who dare to follow its paths. Before we begin, I want to dedicate this to my husband, Yuri. Our motto, Fortuna Audaces Juvat. Yuri, this reading is for you. May it bring a moment of peace, a quiet breath, and the feeling that you are not alone. Happy New Year. And now, let's begin. Chapter 2. Caribou Hunting near Lake St. John. With such excellent sign of deer on all sides, we made sure that it would not be long before we saw our first stag. But in this, we were woefully disappointed. We stayed a week in Salo's camp, tramping miles every day up the river, through the forest, and onto the high ground, without seeing a single stag, and only one fresh track of a big fellow. And of him, I believe, I just caught a glimpse as he disappeared into a dense alder bed. Soon I became weary of thrashing around in this forest-bound country and sighed for a place where I could wander about in the open and look for things with my telescope. Far to the northwest, I could see with the glass an inviting-looking country where the white men had never been, so Saunders said, and Saunders had penetrated farther than anyone in the swampy regions. So we decided to move on. As my guide said, we could easily cut a road with the axe up to the high ground, and that we should be nearly sure in time to strike the main leads of the caribou that were known to journey southwest from the eastern forests. It sounded inviting, so we left the next morning, September 4, and paddled to the northern corner where a brook came in. A disposition of the stores was soon made, and we started, carrying bed, waterproof sheet, and food for 3 days. This was enough for the present, for if things looked well, Jack could keep coming back to the lake to fetch whatever we wanted. Saunders went in front with his axe and cut a path for us to follow, but as we advanced to the higher ground, this became unnecessary owing to the presence of heavily indented caribou leads, which got broader and more numerous as we proceeded. Near the upper edge of the forest, the deer roads were so numerous and had been so well used for years past that Saunders was in the highest spirits, for these, he said, must be the main trails of which he had suspected the existence somewhere in the neighborhood. About midday, we emerged onto beautiful undulating high ground covered with blueberries and a short bush called locally Gaudi. We had hardly done so when 4 caribou does came to look at us. A little farther on, 2 others came for a close inspection, and though we now wanted meat badly, Having eaten the best part of the doe I had previously killed, I resisted the temptation to fire, as I hoped to see a stag very soon. Everything now looked so promising that I sent Jack back to the boats to get more supplies, having determined to make a standing camp here. Even if I waited a month, I knew the stags were bound to come this way sooner or later. After a hurried meal, Saunders and I set off to find the highest point above our camp, and soon selected a large stone from whence a splendid view could be obtained for 3 or 4 miles in any direction. Many of the main trails led up from the woods below, and anything moving out must be detected, nor was there long to wait. Almost as soon as I had got the glass out, I spotted a doe and a calf walking uphill. Then another snow-white object on the edge of the woods revealed another female, and a few minutes later 2 more were to be seen moving slowly uphill about a mile to the left. The glass was here of the greatest assistance, for I counted no less than 15 doe caribou coming out of the woods before my companion had seen one. The migration of the females had evidently just commenced, for they all passed uphill to the west, and then, as I afterwards found, swung away to the southwest. It was growing late, but was one of those perfect autumn evenings that tempt a man just to sit and enjoy the play of light and shade on distant hill and forest. Saunders talked away of his seal hunting days, and I was quite happy enjoying the landscape, working the glass, or watching the gaggles of Canadian geese that frequently passed us, for this country was evidently a great breeding ground. In a little while it would be too dark to see, and there really seemed no chance of the stag showing up. It was too warm, and they were all up by this time in the forests, munching the moss that grows so luxuriantly within a few yards of their now well-worn beds. "I don't believe there's a blessed stag outside the woods in Newfoundland," said Saunders, yawning as he lay on his back, chewing blueberries and, as he expressed it, tired o'-lookin'. "Well," I replied, "I believe there's one anyhow, Bob," for at that moment I had caught in the glass the white stern of a deer feeding about a mile below in a little marsh. A small bit of horn stuck out at one side, though his head seemed half hidden in a peat hole. I kept the glass fixed, and in a minute he turned sideways and revealed the form and antlers of a caribou stag, and a big one too, at last. There he was, feeding right in the open and the wind perfect. Just the sight every hunter longs for. Leaving Saunders with the glass to watch events, I hurried down the hill and easily kept out of sight, even in a stooping position, till within 400 yards of the beast. A momentary glimpse showed him to be still feeding, so I went on slowly in a crouching attitude till within 300 yards. Here I found it necessary to crawl for about 200 yards, and getting a large rock between myself and the deer, found on peeping round the edge of a stone that I was within 90 yards. There was evidently no hurry, so I sat down and enjoyed my first view of one of the grandest beasts in existence, feeding unconcernedly at a short distance. During 5 minutes, he only once raised his head, and then only to take a stupid and sleepy survey of his surroundings as the wet moss dropped out of the sides of his mouth. How splendid his long shovels and bays looked as he assumed a dignified attitude against the yellow sunset. But I could not leave him longer, as the light was going fast, so getting a good sitting position against the rock, I put the white foresight on his heart and fired. Looking up, to my surprise, I saw that the stag had never moved except to raise his head, and thinking that I must have missed, I fired again at once and saw 4 great feet kicking in the air. He was dead as soon as I got up, certainly not one of the best, But nevertheless, as I afterwards learned, he carried a good head. The horns were still in the velvet, and the beast had evidently just come out for a quiet snack in an undisturbed place. He gave me the idea of an old animal going back slightly, as his tops were not up to the mark. The usual rejoicings over the first trophy may be passed over, and seeing that the does, which always move a good 2 weeks before the stags, were only just beginning to travel, I knew it would not do to be too sanguine about getting another stag for some time. We were in for a long wait, especially as the glorious weather which we had experienced so far showed no signs of breaking. Every morning the sun rose in a cloudless sky, and every evening set in an ocean of flame. There had been a wet summer, so we were experiencing the consequent reaction. Saunders, who had never seen the like before, was nevertheless full of explanations and prognostications. Every evening he would minutely explain the particular position of certain clouds and how they always foretold rain or snow in Newfoundland. But when the morning came and the sky was as brilliant as usual, he would be silent on the subject. Evening, however, always gave him renewed hope, and he would begin to prophesy again. For 3 weeks, during which Saunders repeatedly declared that he would die of sunstroke if the tropical heat continued, there was not a drop of rain, and Newfoundland experienced the driest season on record. About this time, Saunders ceased being a weather prophet and became somewhat sad. Never before, said he, were such things known, to come so far and see so few stags. And I could see that his anxiety was chiefly because he feared I should be disappointed and wished to turn home. Nothing, however, was further from my thoughts. We had plenty of provisions, and I knew that as soon as the weather broke, we should get stags. I'm clean off my bearings, as the bank's captain said one day in a fog. According to my calculations, we're 50 miles inside the Labrador woods, and that's about the size of it just now, said my companion one day, as we seated ourselves after a fruitless tramp. Such a sight of deer, and ne'er a stag. For 4 days we wandered over the high rocky barrens and open timber, hoping to meet a traveling stag. We made from 10 to 15 miles a day over fairly easy ground, difficulties only presenting themselves when we entered the wood trails, which were sometimes soft going. Twice we nearly reached a large lake which we saw to the northwest, but to achieve this was rather more than we felt inclined to undertake as yet, until we had exhausted the intervening ground. The next stag we found involved rather an interesting follow-on chase, which I give from my diary. September 8. At daybreak, from the high ground above St. John's Lake, I spied 8 does and 3 stags, all coming along the high ridge above the new lake. They were about 2 miles off, and were traveling and feeding at short intervals. One of the stags seemed to be a big beast with a fair head, so I determined to try and catch him before he reached the timber for which he seemed to be making, to lie up for the day. First we had to cross a wooded valley, and in this we disturbed 2 does, which fortunately moved off in a safe direction. Once on the ridge, and on the spot where we had seen the game, I spied again, and soon found the white sterns of the deer, which had fed on for about a mile. They were walking fast, and when a caribou is walking fast, you have to run. Not more than a mile ahead of the animals was the opening of the forest, and so it was a case of who would get there first. The ground was perfectly flat and open, and so we had to run upwind, keeping just inside the forest on the north side so as to gain cover. This made the traveling most arduous. To walk in the tangle of larch scrub, peat holes, and fallen trees is hard enough work, but to head traveling caribou by running through such obstacles was almost beyond our strength. 3 times we sank to earth utterly exhausted and could only be revived by taking a look at the deer, which seemed to keep almost parallel to our route. There were only another few hundred yards more to fight through, and as it was a case of now or never, we made one final effort and arrived at a long point of small larch, just as the first of the caribou, an old doe, came walking along. I think a fair chance would hardly have presented itself even then, had not a broad series of leads converged and led sharply to the right at this point, for the old lady, after stopping and carefully sniffing about to see if other deer had passed, determined to adopt this route, and so threw the game into our hands. I saw they would all come by nicely, so sat still and strove to quiet my heaving chest. The rifle performed strange parabolas in the air as I tried the sight tentatively on her shoulder. It seemed hopeless to shoot whilst in such a condition, yet the stag was due in a few seconds, and I must try and compose myself. 1, 2, 6, 8 big does filed slowly past at about 100 yards. Then after an interval came a small stag, then at a longer interval another stag about 4 years old, and then for a while, nothing. Where on earth was the big fellow? Had he left them? I moved slightly forward to verify my suspicions, when the rolling horns and broad back of the warrantable beast came into view. How differently a big adult walks from a younger one. He seems indifferent to his safety, especially when in the company of others, and the Newfoundland expression of "soaking along" seems to exactly express his solemn, lazy mode of progression. He did not seem inclined to stop, even when Saunders and I both whistled, so I had to take him as he walked. At the shot he skipped, and I felt sure he was fatally hit. This, however, was not the case, but as he galloped across in my front, looking quite happy, I fired again and knocked him head over heels with a bullet through the shoulders. The other deer now seemed to lose their heads and ran around in the most stupid fashion. Even when we went up to the fallen stag, they behaved altogether as no other deer do when frightened or suspicious. The stag was a fair-sized beast, but had rather a poor head, which I had mistaken for something better, seeing it only on the skyline, a mistake all stalkers may make at times. Yet I wish now I had not killed him. Saw 35 deer today. During the next few days, I did nothing but explore and map the country and make a few sketches of the new ground and lakes to the northwest. Sometimes we slept out at night, taking Jack to carry my bed and making a shelter of spruce boughs. The men seemed quite merry and happy now, as long as they had a good fire of birch and plenty to eat. They had got over the idea that I wanted to shoot a big stag every day, and were now content to wait for the good ones when they should make their appearance. Altogether, we had a very jolly time, and little Bob told me stories of his early days, which I was never tired of listening to. Saunders' father had been the master of a little brigantine, which he had built himself down, at Green's Pond, Bonavista Bay. With this little vessel, he went every year to the seals and did pretty well till one fatal spring when the boat got caught in the ice and was driven ashore at Point of Feather, Harbor Grace. But Saunders can tell his own story in briefer and more picturesque language than I, so I give it in his own words. I got carried to the ice hunting myself when I was no more than 7.5 years old, said the old man as he reflectively puffed at his twisted plug. Most wonderful tobacco this, after which a long pause, only broken by sounds of suction. Well, go on, Bob, I said. Tell us all about it. What you got that book out for? Oh, just to make some notes on seal hunting. Oh, and the old man positively blushed. You ain't going to put me in one of them books of yours, are you? Well, what if I am? I shan't say anything nasty about you anyhow, unless you hurry up and get on about that time you got carried to the ice as a child. After this threat, the tale proceeded without a break, whilst Jack occasionally offered encouraging suggestions such as, "You don't say. Well, well, Bob, that's what it is now. You know I was brought up 'mongst seals and seal folk, and I can't recollect no time when my dad weren't going to the ice and my mother weren't scared. Swales, seals, was much to us in the spring, for it meant about what we lived on, whether the seals drove down in the spring or not, and we struck 'em. So when I was a little chap, my mother used to put me to bed and make me say prayers like this when Swales was about. Lord God Almighty, send a swile for Daddy, and send a swile for Mama, and a swile for Uncle Jim, and one for Uncle Jim's wife, and a swile for little Tommy, and one each for George and Mary, and a swile for each of Cousin Will's family, not forgetting a swile for Aunt Jane, what's a poor widder. And oh Lord, don't let the ice blow off shore when Daddy's aboard, and bring 'en safe to hum. Amen." Then my mother would call all over our relations to see I hadn't forgot none, and if I hadn't remember 'em all, she'd make me say the prayer all again. A was a loose, active little kid, and used to help the men getting things aboard Bonava Bay when my dad went to the sea, and one spring I scooted up on deck and found the sea running by and us far out in the bay. "Good Lord," said my dad, "here's that child, little Bob." I said I'd gone to sleep in the cabin just before they was starting. They couldn't put back, so I got took. It was mighty cold, but I didn't mind that, as the men were kind to me, and Dad let me come on the ice one day, and I killed a seal. You know, sir, that when we gets to be young men in this country, they don't think much of a chap unless he's been to the ice. It's a sort of test of hardiness, and the girls think a heap of the young fellers that's been once or twice to the swale fishin' and come back free with their money. It's just dog's work while it lasts, but somehow there's an excitement in it that sets young fellers kind of restless in the spring, and 'fore they know, they're a-signing on with Joe Windsor or Sam Blandford. We sealers say, too, that man'll go for a swile where gold won't drag on. I was but 15 when old Sam asked me to go with him as cabin boy, and after that I goes to the ice every spring for 22 years. "Is that so?" interposed Jack, with a look of profound respect. There was another long pause, but when a man's in the humor to talk, it is best to do nothing but look interested. Presently, little Bob resumed. My first season with Sam, we struck the harps, Greenland seals, northeast of the Funks, and killed 4,100 in a week. In those days, if you killed 2 seals, you had one of them, not like now, when you only take every 4th seal, and sometimes not that. We didn't form piles of seals as they do now, but stuck pretty close to the vessel and hauled 2 seals a man. We never spent a night out on the ice, and Alis went off with a piece of fat pork, a few biscuits, and cakes. When times was good, we'd take a few billets of wood to make coffee and eat the raw heart of the young whitecoats. Captains was kind to their men and looked after them as friends. We made a bit of money then, and them was the good times of sealing when men weren't treated worse than dogs as they are now. And little Bob puffed fiercely at his pipe. Now it's full speed ahead up into the good ice. 200 men in a foul tub not fit to carry 30, and a bully to thrash you out of your bunk whether you're fit to go to the ice or no. They fling you out on the floe ice with a few billets of wood and steams away a day to dump off another crowd. And like as not, you've got to spend the night out with your clothes freezing on you, for you're bound to fall in the cracks least once a night, however loose you may be. There's no room below once the steam winch gets a-going and seals a-comin' aboard. So up comes the coal, and what with the grit and the blubber, 200 men can't sleep very comfortable on the open decks in a mass of muck with the cold freezing your marrow. I wonder the men stand it and they get crews year after year, I suggested. That's 'cause you don't know what the poverty of Newfoundland is, returned the old man sadly. There's boys goes once or twice to prove they're men, but the crews don't consist of them. It's the poor, the very poor, and they just have to go or starve. It's this way. You see, there's lots of poor fisher folk all along the coast and islands that never sees a dollar from one year end to another. For they goes to cod fishing in summer, the merchants give 'em grub to keep their families all summer while they're away. Fishing goes on till October, and by December they've got nothing, so has to go to the merchants again to get tick in provisions to last 'em through the winter. Then to pay this off, they have to go to the seals in the spring, or they won't get no more credit, as the merchants also own the seal vessels. Only the captains make any money at the seals, and they're good fellers as a rule. But if they lose a vessel or let their men break out, as they do at times, they're soon as poor as the rest of us. It'd make your heart sore to see the way lots of these islanders come aboard the sealin' vessels in the spring, with pinched, half-starved faces, and hardly enough clothes to stand a summer breeze. Yes, I've seen pretty rough times at the ice, especially in the old sailin' vessel days. One spring with Dad, we were out 2.5 months without taking a single white coat. We got caught in the ice and a heavy gale came out from the nor'west, and none of us ever expected to see Green's Pond no more. We was 22 days smashing to and fro in the ice, with all our boats gone and the bulwarks stove in. But by and by, Dad got her nose to the gale, and after 5 days and 5 nights the gale rounded, and we got out and made Harbor Grace half full of water. It was rough, I can say, no sleep, in at the pumps all the time. Next year, Dad lost his vessel. got caught in the ice, and drove up in Point of Feather, Harbor Grace. So I shipped with Captain John Han for 4 or 5 springs. Then I went with Captain Sam Windsor for a spell, and then with Captain Kane and Captain Green. I also did 2 trips with young Bill Windsor. Most wonderful sealman was old Captain Sam Windsor. The men on the East Coast used to say that he could generally tell where the seals was before he went out. Some 20 men, friends of mine, went one spring from Green Bay to Green's Pond to get a berth with Captain Carter. The ship was about full, so only 10 could sign on, and the others had to walk home again, feeling sick and hungry. On the way home, they saw old Captain Sam Windsor standing at the door of his house, and he, after asking their business, invited the whole lot in to breakfast. Then he says to 'em, "Don't be downhearted, boys, for not getting a berth with Carter. The shore men have been hauling white coats these 2 days in Green and White Bay. Green Bay is full of spoil, so hurry home and look on the driven ice, and you'll do better than gain with Carter." Each of those men killed about 60 apiece, and Carter got no seals. First spring, Bill Windsor, his son, had a steam vessel. I went with him. She was called the Vanguard, and we got jammed in the ice off Belleville Island, near to the Gray Islands, on March 10. We couldn't move, so he sent me, being a loose iceman, over the ice to see if I could get to the islands and hear news of the seals. It was moonlight, and I traveled 9 miles over pretty rotten stuff to the North Island, and then 9 miles more across the Tickle to the next. Then I had to go 6 miles across the land, for I met 2 young men. They told me that swells had been driving by into White Bay for 7 days and 7 nights. They themselves had hooked 17 white coats out of the slob, shore ice. One told me also Captain Toomey was anchored under the island, so I went straight back to my ship and was pretty well done up, as I hadn't had a bite to eat for 24 hours, and had fell in twice and was most froze. By and by, Captain Bill comes to me and asks me if I would take a letter to Captain Toomey, as none of the other men liked to go. So after a few hours' sleep and a feed, I starts again, and after a rare job delivers my letter to Captain Toomey. "Your captain, Saunders," says Toomey to me, "is of the same mind as I am. Those seals that's been passing is only a patch of the southern pack. The main body is away north in the straits, Belle Isle. So when I gets back to my ship, the captain he up anchor and we're off to the straits and the Labrador, and we didn't take nar a seal. When we come back to St. John's, we finds all the other vessels had filled with seals up in White Bay. So it shows there's such a thing as being too clever," concluded the old man sententiously. I thought he'd finished his seal talk for the time being, but Jack supplied a sequel by remarking, "Bob, sing us the song the sealmen used to make about that trip." "Oh, that's rot, that's nothing." "Well, let's have a bit of it anyhow, Bob," I suggested. After some further persuasion, the old hunter began to half sing and half recite the following lines in a cracked voice. "That plows the raging main. Come all you jolly icemen. I'll tell you of the Vanguard. Likewise our captain's name. His name is Captain Windsor. Sailed out from Bonava's Bay. in search of those young whitecoats, but still he got astray. We steamed her down off Belleville. 'Twas there our trials to begin in. For 3 long days or 4, we drift by the grey islands. 'Twas here early near shore. Our captain come on deck. He says, "Bob Saunders, you'll go get my boy and try to get on shore or hear from Captain Toomey on board the Commodore." We boarded, as you may understand, a steamboat nigh 3 miles from us, a breakage from the Gull Rock. It set the Vanguard free. She steamed into the harbor along with the other 3. Our people from the island. These words I hear them say. Driven in White Bay, slipped in the spot of seals. I don't remember no more, broke off Saunders, suddenly becoming modest, but it's mostly wrought about myself, and he refused to speak further of his plucky act. Hunting the Greenland seal from ships and hunting the same from the storm-swept coast of Newfoundland are 2 different matters. The chase in both cases is beset with sudden and dreadful dangers, seldom foreseen and often incapable of being warded off. In both, the advent of sudden storms may cause the grinding heavy mass to pack on the coast, and thence whirl it seawards again, where it is dispersed in fragments with its human freight. The ships can often, and generally do, rescue their men when these untoward circumstances occur. But the lot of the poor coast hunter who snatches his precarious living from the outports is hardness itself, for when difficulties come, he has but his own wits and bravery to help him. The wind that sweeps the ice in, bearing on its bosom the tempting white coat, may veer at any moment and drive the whole mass offshore again, and then only the watchfulness of the land, lookouts, and the ready resources of the men can save a disaster. It takes real and solid courage to make a good seal hunter, not the somewhat theatrical bravery of the soldier who leads a forlorn hope, but the dogged 3 o'clock in the morning article that takes things humbly and expects but little reward. The true story of the Newfoundland ice fields is not, nor ever will be written, nor will the names of its many heroes be penned in the pages of an undying history, but in the minds of many today who have taken part in that annual strife with the forces of nature, there live scores of instances of marvelous courage and unselfish devotion. Down on the barren East Coast, they tell the story of Matilda Barwood and her half-witted son, born out of wedlock. She loved the boy who grew almost to man's estate, and when he crept off in his quiet way, after the others in the springtime, she used to watch in the dusk for his return, going with the other women of the village. For in their universal charity, she had long since been forgiven. One evening, as the men were returning, the wind veered suddenly, and in less than a minute there was a wide gap formed between the rocks on the shore and the pack. This little tickle, as it is called, was not quite open water, but a space of slushy, fine fragments of ice on which none can run except the most experienced icemen. In a few minutes, most of the men, being skilled from their youth, ran across the dividing distance, which was every moment becoming broader. As the roll of the ocean caused the rotten ice to rise, they fell on their faces and lay flat, thus preventing a slip through. All passed safely over except Jim Barworth, whose courage seemed to have deserted him. "Come, Jim, boy, try it now," cried his mother. "You can do it sure." But Jim could not face it and ran backwards and forwards in a panic. She kept calling to him again and again, as an anxious hind calls her calf, but he would not come, and sank on the ice, hiding his face in his hands. Suddenly the woman ran out on the rotten ice and would perhaps have crossed, had not a wave risen, formed a crack, into which she disappeared forever. At that moment Jim looked up and sprang to his feet, for he loved his mother much. He gave but one glance round and rushed across the dreaded space with outstretched arms. But too late. The crack opened again, and in death mother and son were not divided. The weather still being brilliant, I revisited Salusa's camp for 2 days, and then went down to the east end of the St. John's Lake for another 2 days, but in neither of these places did we see even a small stag, so returned again to my standing camp to the northwest of the lake. Nearly all hunters have superstitions, and on September 15, I discovered that neither Bob nor Jack were above this pardonable weakness. "I dreamed of Mrs. Barry last night," said Jack solemnly at breakfast time. "Then we're sure to kill a big stag today," echoed Saunders with conviction. Questioned as to the connection between this estimable lady, the wife of a storekeeper in Alexander Bay, and the monarch of the woods, Saunders at once gave the requisite explanation. Once the old man Stroud had been hunting for nigh a fortnight, and ne'er a stag had he seen, till one night he seen Mrs. Barry, who's a lady of precision down our bay, sitting on the top of a big stag and smiling at him. Next day, Stroud kills a great one. Again on the same trip, one of the packers, Dan Burton to name, he dreams he's been a-talking to Mrs. Barry, and sure enough, Stroud's party kills another big stag. There's some connection between the deer and that lady, for last year Johnny here sees her in his sleep, and next day Mr. Salus kills the finest head I ever seen. We don't really think much on Mrs. Barry, but when she comes to us, we're mighty glad. The sun was sending great fiery shafts of light across the eastern sky, and painting the emerald woods with crimson and gold as we stepped out of the forest on this particular morning. We thought ourselves out early, but a flock of Canadian geese rose clamorously from an upland marsh, and a pair of great northern divers were calling querulously from the clouds, showing that others had been up a while before us. On a little lake up near the first spying place, some dusky ducks were paddling along the edge and turning upside down in the familiar fashion of our own mallards. It was a glorious waking to life, and we sat for a while, enjoying the crisp morning air and wondering if the stags ever intended to move. "Think we'll take a walk round Island Pond today," said Saunders, suggesting a new ground, and to this I at once acquiesced, as my guide said that an old stag or two generally summered there in the stunted and isolated belts of spruce, often coming to the lake shore in the evening. At noon we rested for our regular midday tea by a little stream. where were many larches recently scraped by a caribou stag. "That feller's close about here somewhere," said Saunders, and so he was, for soon after commencing our stealthy walk round the isolated drakes, I suddenly looked to my left and saw the broad back and snowy neck of the game we sought for. We had surprised the deer within 80 yards, and he was feeding unconcernedly, so I ought not to have hurried as I did to take him from the shoulder, as there was time to get into an easy position in which I could have made a certainty of the shot. Immediately the stag turned sideways, I fired, the bullet going too high over his back. The deer at once galloped away from the cover a few yards and again stood. This time I hit him on the horn, which frightened him considerably and caused an instantaneous retreat to the woods. As he galloped away, I pulled again without effect, and yet again as he crossed a little slough about 150 yards away. "You have him," said Jack. "I saw the hair fly from his side, but I did not think so, seeing that the stag had, after the shot, galloped away easily, and then starting back with raised head and tail, an extended scut, leapt in the air and took a few long slinging steps to the rear. Then he gave one wild comprehensive survey of the landscape, kicked some stones into the air, and galloped away out of sight as hard as his legs would carry him. We now ran forward, and on rounding a belt of forest, saw my stag lying dead in the open. My last shot had taken him right through the heart. The head was a very ordinary specimen of that grown by the average Newfoundland caribou. During the walk home it was terribly hot, and Saunders, having the head to carry, became thirsty, and most unwisely drank some water out of a stagnant pool. When we got to camp, he complained of feeling ill and could eat nothing. Unfortunately, too, the brandy had been left down at the boats on Lake St. John, so it was daybreak before Jack started to fetch the only medicine we possessed. By the evening, Saunders was much better and ate some dinner, and next morning expressed himself as quite recovered and able to try the ground near the new lake on which I had fixed some hopes. At the east end of this lake, which was a large sheet of water some 25 miles round, and now named after me, is a broad open marsh. This space connected two great forests, and by all reasoning, we assumed that many of the deer that would eventually come from the northern woods must cross this flat to reach the southern woods. It was directly in the line of migration, nearly southwest, and so we decided to go down and examine the marsh, and, if there should be a good show of leads passing across it, to camp there for a week and let the deer come to us. Jack came with us as usual now, for he was a sociable fellow and hated being left in camp by himself, and, as apart from other considerations, he had sharp eyes. I liked to have him with me. A pleasant walk of 5 or 6 miles over the high ridge and then down through the timber for another 2 miles brought us to the eastern end of the new lake. I did not go on to the shore, but stopped behind examining a splendid series of fresh caribou trails leading, as I had hoped they would, right across the marsh and round the lake edge. It was the very place to meet the deer, and I could put my camp in a droke of spruce close to the water's edge, as long as the north wind, which had now started, continued to hold. I sat down to rest, well satisfied with the outlook, when Jack, who had gone to fill the kettle, suddenly came rushing back to me to say that a stag and a doe were at that moment swimming across the lake. Sure enough, there they were, far out in the center of the lake and making for the southern shore about a mile to our left. There was no time to be lost, as caribou swim fast, so we got off at once, and fortunately found that the forest, which was new to us, was not so dense as usual, and that we could progress at a fair rate under cover. Looking over a high bank which concealed the point for which the deer were making, I saw the animals coming on fast about 400 yards away and heading straight for our position. Here I took the telescope from Saunders, who now expressed the opinion that the stag was a small one, and after bringing it to bear on the horned one, I was forced to a similar conclusion. The two deer now must have seen us, or changed their minds as to a landing place, for they suddenly turned to a right angle and gave me a good broadside view. The appearance of the deer with horns now presented a somewhat different aspect. It had upturned brow points like a red deer, and a thin gray neck utterly unlike that of any young stag. "That's a doe," I said to Saunders, handing him the glass to take a look. "Yes," replied my companion, "and with the biggest horns I ever see in my life." The two deer had now separated, the unhorned doe coming straight on and landing within a few yards of us before dashing into the forest, whilst the other one, whose head I now coveted, had turned east again and was making for a gravel bank about half a mile on our back tracks. The wind being perfect, I easily headed the deer and gave her a bullet immediately she landed on the shore. She carried unusually large horns of 12 points and was evidently an old yelled doe. As a rule, caribou does have no horns to speak of, and as it was of scientific interest to know what proportion of females carried these cranial appendages, I kept a careful list of all the deer seen by myself during the trip, and what percentage of, in this case, the uglier sex were so ornamented. Number of female caribou seen, 306, made up of 1 with 12 points, 1 with 8 points, 6 with 4 points, 40 with 3 points, about 20 with 2 points, 130 with no horns, or with only small knobby excrescences. On our way home, we noticed little sign of stags traveling, but on going up out of the forest, we ran right up against a good beast, which I killed without any stalking, or in fact, any incident that is worth recording. He simply stood and looked at me from about 50 yards, and I shot him from the shoulder. He had a pretty but not a large head of 26 points, and was evidently a young stag. On the night of September 17, Jack baked bread for 3 days, as we had decided on a 3 days tramp to the east until the stags should show signs of moving past the new lake to the north, whence I hoped to go by and by. As we left the wood close to our camp, we came on the fresh sign of a black bear not an hour old. "Shouldn't wonder if that cuss cleans out our camp while we're gone," murmured Saunders reflectively as he examined it. Then, as we tramped along, the old man indulged in a few reminiscences. "I've knowed and do that more'n once, and play funny with the whole outfit. There was an Indian named Stephen lived down our bay a while back. He was just the best trapper in Newfoundland, and he told me once when I was in furrin trapping with him that one night he wakes up sudden 'cause the fire had gone out, and across the glow he sees a great black thing mavin'. "Who's there?" he call out, seizing his gun. The feller don't answer, so he rips it on and finds he's killed a large black bear what's eaten out of his sugar can. Stephen, he killed more bears than any feller in Newfoundland, and one fall he come to me and Jack's father and said he'd shot the largest kind of a bear about 10 miles back, and said, too, we could get all the fat and meat if we'd come. So he and little Jack here, he weren't more than a child of 10 then, starts off, and late that evening we come to the carcass. I never seed such a bear as that, 9 feet long, if he was an inch. And I've seen as many bear in Newfoundland as anyone but Stephen. We started for home next morning. Little Jack here carrying a load that made his nose bleed, but he wouldn't give up or say a word, the little varmint.
Jack looked shy and utterly uninterested as the old man continued.
Stephen was married to the daughter of old Jim Baxter, himself half an Indian, and a man that had spent all his days reaving through the woods, so of course he warn't of much account. People was mighty civil to Stevie as they was afraid of him, and that's the way of most. Yet he was a merry cuss, singing and laughing all the time, and nothing to scare a body till ye caught his eyes, and then folk was apt to feel cold. He tried to knife one young chap for spilling some coffee on his toes, and he used to say straight that if he found any white man trapping bear or hunting deer too far from the bay, he'd shoot 'em dead, so most folks stop at home. He'd a great name as a hunter, and whiles used to take town's fellers to the woods. That is, them as didn't know and was fools enough to go with Course those days they got nothing 'cause Steve 'ud tramp 'em all through the meshes and scare every mother's son a deer so long as the grub lasted. One time he go out with a young'un from St. John's named Molony for a fortnight, and when they come back, that feller ain't seen so much as a deer's scut. So I asked Steve, who liked me somehow, how 'twas.
"What, me show Molony deer?" says he sarcastic, "while there's sugar and coffee and bacon. Oh, no, that ain't Stevie." And the old man and Jack indulged in an amused chuckle.
I was interested in this queer character, so in response to my request for more Steve, Saunders continued. There was a loud blowin' bullion feller that kept a merchant store down Banava Bay and made lots of money by cheating us poor folk. His name was Stanley, and he was powerful fond of the gun. One fall he goes in with Steve, and after a week of seeing nothing but drokes and meshes, he gets mad and cusses the Indian, said he'd lied to him and that he'd be off for home right there at once and make things hot for him. Stephen never said a word at first, but just looks at him with his cold eyes. Then he darts off, saying he'd show him deer for sure that day. They just walked and walked and walked, and by, Steve tells the feller to sit down and take a spell while he goes into the timber to light a fire and boil kettle. Presently, the man from Banava's Bay gets cold and hungry, and he goes to find Steve and the kittle. But the Indian was far away by that time, and he didn't ever see him again, least not for some time.
"How did the man get out, Bob?"
Well, if it hadn't been that there was plenty blueberries that fall, and he had a box of matches, he certainly wouldn't have seen Bonava's Bay again, for he was clean lost. It took him 3 days 'fore he struck the Terra Nova River, where some loggers picked on up famished and most crazy. When Stanley got back to the salt water, first man he met was Steva, looking as sweet and pleasant as a day in June. "Oh, you damned rascal," screamed the wanderer. "I'm going now to the magistrate to have you arrested, and you'll be jailed sure for 2 years. "Very well," says Stevie, "and as soon as I come out, I shoot you dead very quick." Stanley stood in the road for some time thinking about it all, and then he walks home. They was all afraid to do anything to Stevie, but he didn't get many hunting parties after that trip. I thought he had finished, but seeing my interest in the character of this wild creature, he volunteered yet another excellent tale. "Ever hear that old Newfoundland yarn of Steve and the 2 sports? No? Well, you know you can't lose an Indian even supposing you put him down blindfold in the center of the island and tell him to make for St. John's. And what's more, they don't like to be told they may be going faulty or there's apt to be trouble. Well, one fall, after he'd nearly killed the Bonava man, Steve takes in 2 townies to hunt. Disremember their names, but we'll call them Johnny and George. Johnny stays in camp one day, and Steve goes off with George Fur to find a deer. They reeves around all day, now in the woods, now on the meshes, till by nightfall George gets uncomfortable and doesn't know where he is, and is precious sure the Indian don't know either, 'cause our woods is tough, as you know. By and by, Steve sits down to light a fire. "Guess we're lost," says George. "Oh no," says Steve, looking up kinda sour. "Indian not lost. Indian never lost. Campin' Johnny lost." "That's good, Bob. Where's Steve now?" I said. "Dead. Dead 6 winters ago. The woods and rather things done for him, as it does for all of us in time. He was haulin' a deer long the ice of George's pond when he slipped up and cracked his skull. He got home to the bay, but died a few weeks after. I seen him just 'fore he goes, and he say to me, 'Saunders, whiskey's bad for haulin' deer.'" When the last words of the 2nd chapter of Newfoundland and its untrodden ways dissolve over the harsh wastelands, let the quiet whisper of the wind in the pines lead you to a peaceful rest. In this earthly embrace of wild nature, gently slip into the quiet harbor of sleep, where images freely wander under the lunar expanses. Good night from Salty Slumber Stories. Rest well, brave wanderers, until the time when a new untamed adventure calls us. Sleep soundly, and let the wild land gently lull you